transmitiendo. Vamos a rescatar el enlace y comenzamos.
Desde Panamá, Carla.
Hola Carla, gracias por asistir.
Hola a todos, Fanny.
Me llegó la notificación. Vamos a rescatar el enlace y comenzamos. Vamos a rescatar el enlace y comenzamos.
Y ahí está el enlace, lo sube al...
Sí, al colto y ahí replicamos.
Y ahí empezó a difundirlo. Perfecto.
Y ahí se está transmitiendo bien.
Sí.
Súper. Vamos nomás, Jenny.
Ya, démosle nomás.
Buenas noches, colegas. Buenas noches a los colegas que se han ido conectando a la plataforma Zoom y los que van a ir conectando también a la plataforma YouTube. Bienvenidos a una tercera jornada ya de webinar, tercera de 5. Esperemos que hoy día sea bastante provechoso. Hoy día vamos a ver modelos centrados en ocupación. Ahí Jennifer nos va a hacer una introducción respecto a la colega que nos va a dar este webinar. Y la idea va a ser proyectar un video, pero vamos a ir haciendo pausas entre medio para que Jenny nos haga la continuidad y nos haga un poco el resumen de cada una de las partes de este video. Y si en algún minuto tienen dificultades con los subtítulos, me avisan nomás para que vayamos ajustándolo acorde a las necesidades también de cada uno. Jennifer.
Eso, buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por asistir el día de hoy. Bueno, quiero darle las gracias a Sebastián y a Leo que nos están acompañando hoy día, excusar a Luciana que tenía compromiso y no podía asistir, a Luciana Wertheimer de Brasil, y contarles que en esta presentación va a estar hoy día la profesora asociada y doctora Jodie Copley, que es una terapeuta ocupacional australiana que ha hecho una carrera súper larga en razonamiento clínico en terapia ocupacional, en práctica centrada en la ocupación en terapia ocupacional y también, aparte de este foco que tiene como en la formación de terapeutas ocupacionales, también ha trabajado tiene un modelo de razonamiento clínico en espasticidad de extremidad superior para el manejo de espasticidad. Entonces ese es el webinar que vamos a estar presentando en un tiempo. Quería contar que anticipar que el video dura 1 hora 40, por lo tanto estábamos conversando porque es harta la información y tiene además el análisis de un video entre medio y hartos ejemplos de casos clínicos bien aplicados, entonces lo que podamos hacer es parar en medio, hacer como un break chiquitito de 2 o 3 minutos para que nos paremos, tengamos la información sensorial que necesitamos para seguir y después ver la segunda parte. Lo otro que quería contarles es disculparme en torno al formato, porque contaba anteriormente que para poder hacer los subtítulos, traté de hacerlo en una aplicación, porque sale mucho más claro. Ustedes van a ver los primeros 30 minutos están en esa aplicación, en esa software. El problema es que me demoré 4 días en hacer 30 minutos de video, entonces no iba a alcanzar el tiempo para poder subtitular todo, así es que tuve que hacer la segunda parte en YouTube, y esa parte se ven menos claras las diapositivas. Por lo tanto, lo que vamos a hacer es que después que termine la presentación, yo les puedo enviar, o voy a poner en la página web, el PDF de la presentación, ¿ya? Del PowerPoint, para que quienes quieran acceder. Eso, bueno, Jodie se iba a conectar desde el inicio, pero tuvo unas reuniones encargadas de Teaching and Learning en la universidad, entonces tuvo que asistir a la reunión, pero se va a conectar 5 minutos antes de que tengamos la discusión. Por lo tanto, para que ustedes preparen sus preguntas. Y lo otro es que ¿qué más? Si las personas que están en Zoom quieren hacer preguntas, lo que le decía a Sebastián y el Leo es que a lo mejor podríamos habilitar las pantallas para que ustedes se puedan conectar y hacerle las preguntas directamente a Jodie. Ahora voy a abrir la presentación, que donde estábamos probando se me perdió.
Sí, también recordar que estamos en la plataforma YouTube Y hasta este momento tenemos 30 espectadores, así que también vamos a estar ahí. No vamos a tener la posibilidad de abrir los micrófonos, pero voy a estar atento a poder registrar y poder repetir todas las preguntas que ustedes quieran hacer desde esa plataforma. Así que estaremos atentos y esperamos que sea una gran jornada muy provechosa y que claramente lo va a hacer. Así que saludo a todos los que están.
Eso, espérate, Leo. Yo voy a compartir porque esa es la segunda parte.
Ok.
Voy a compartir la otra. Espérame.
Tenemos gente desde Brasil, Lima, Mar del Plata, Brasil,
Barcelona.
Puerto Rico.
La Samantha, colega del
Baja.
Austral que está actualmente en Barcelona.
El link de YouTube te lo entrego al tiro, Samantha.
La Carolina Ramírez, que es una de las 30 de YouTube. Carolina Ramírez, manda saludos.
Ya, ahora sí.
Ya.
Perdón la ñurdez.
No te preocupes. Saludos a México también, a Mar del Plata, a Bahía Blanca.
Jalisco.
Dos colegas desde México.
Esto no prendió. Saludos de
También
Colombia.
a Colombia. Faltan los colegas de Costa Rica que se conecten todavía. Si es que no están en off.
Buenos días, everybody.
Espéreme ya. Vamos, que tengo 1000 ventanas abiertas. Estoy un poco...
Sí.
Ya sé lo que voy a hacer. Vamos a correr esta ventana para acá.
Bueno, quiero recordar que la próxima, bueno, va a rellenar un poquitito. Vamos, la próxima sesión la vamos a tener el miércoles 19, también a la misma hora, sobre la teoría de autodeterminación. Y la última sesión ya nos trasladamos al mes de septiembre, que va a ser el miércoles 2, con el manejo de hipertonía en extremidad superior, que es el gran tema de Jody. Así que nos vamos a repetir el plato con ella. Y seguramente va a ser una gran oportunidad para poder conversar y ya resolver algunas preguntas que hayan quedado también en esta sesión.
Sí, y también el miércoles 19 también considerar que vamos a ver un programa de manejo en el hogar también, aparte de la teoría de autodeterminación.
Sí.
Ya.
Ya, ahí estamos. ¿Ven la pantalla con Jody?
Sí, estamos a Jody.
Ya. Vamos a partir ahora, entonces. Disculpen por toda la dispraxia que no me resulta.
Everybody, or buenas noches, because I think it will be evening when you are watching this presentation. My name is Jodie Copley, and I am an Associate Professor of Occupational Therapy at the University of Queensland. And I'm very happy to be presenting to you today. I'm also very proud to be
¿Se perdió?
Principal Advisor for Jenny Garcia in doing her PhD. My areas of research and teaching and practice are working with children and also neurological rehabilitation of the upper limb for both children and
Se perdió el video. Se perdió el video.
patient-centered practice.
Estamos en video.
Ya, espérame.
The reason why
¿Quieren que partamos de nuevo?
Mejor, creo que habíamos avanzado tan poquito que...
56 segundos, disculpas. Ya, ahora sí.
Todavía no.
Wait. ¿Ahora sí?
Ahora sí, perfecto.
Ya, ahora no voy a mover nada. Perdona a todos.
Buenos días, everybody, or buenas noches, because I think it will be evening when you are watching this presentation. My name is Jodie Copley and I am an Associate Professor of Occupational Therapy at the University of Queensland. And I'm very happy to be presenting to you today. I'm also very proud to be the Principal Advisor for Jenny Garcia in doing her PhD. My areas of research and teaching and practice are working with children and also neurological rehabilitation of the upper limb for both children and adults. But today I'm going to be talking to you about occupation-centred practice with children. And the reason why we're discussing occupation-centred practice is because we now have some really good evidence that it's this type of practice, this approach, that is most effective in achieving outcomes for children and families. So recently, there was an Australian researcher, Iona Novak, who conducted a systematic review of all of the published studies on OT intervention with children with a range of different diagnoses. So she's reviewed all of these interventions and classified them according to their outcome and their effectiveness. What she found was that it was the more occupation-centred interventions that delivered the best gains. So she called those activity-based or top-down interventions. And what we mean by top-down is it's those interventions that start at the top, that start with the child's occupational roles and occupational tasks. So the daily tasks that they do every day, and that being the real focus of your intervention was what defined these approaches. So activities-based top-down interventions led to greater gains. Also, parent partnership with the family as you were doing the intervention was effective and worthwhile and led to better outcomes. And the interventions that were most effective in this systematic review had particular features. They were interventions that began with a goal that was important to the child. So the goals that were addressed were goals that came from the child's voice. And the other characteristic was that they, as I said, they are top down or focused on the occupational task. And what that meant is that there was some degree of practicing real life activities in natural environments. So working on handwriting in the classroom, working on dressing or eating during meal times, all of those sorts of activities within the natural context that you would find them. So that research gives us a good grounding to know that these are the characteristics that we want to focus on in our intervention, or at least ensure are incorporated into effective intervention. For myself, my research in terms of occupation-centred practice with children has focused more on the way that students learn these approaches, because as you will see, they're quite different to some of the other approaches that students might learn. There's a lot of problem solving, there's a lot of skilled observation, there's a lot of questioning and reasoning on the spot when you're with the child. So there are some challenges for student learning of the approaches, and I've done some research to look at what helps students to learn these approaches at the university level. The other research that I've done in this area is looking at guidance for therapists in occupation-centred practice, because as I said, they're not particularly easy approaches for students to learn, but also for therapists who might be used to practicing in a different way. It's also a change in the way that they think and the way that they use themselves in therapy. So occupation-centred approaches to practice have really become a lot more popular in Australia over the last 10 to 15 years, but there has been a lot of training for therapists, and lots of communities of practice in assisting each other to change their view of how they do therapy in order to incorporate these approaches. So it hasn't happened very quickly.
Ahí está.
So now I'll define what I mean by an occupation-centred approach, just so you have that in your mind. So I talked about occupational roles and tasks. The key feature of occupation-centred approaches is that you begin and end with the occupational tasks. So you start your assessment, you start your therapy with what is meaningful and essential for the child and for the family within their day-to-day life. So when you first see a child and family, the assessment you do begins with really understanding at a deep level what happens in their day-to-day life. What are the activities that are most challenging for them? What are they able to do? What are they not able to do? And we would talk about getting a very clear occupational picture of what's going on in these activities. So you begin with the occupational task and understanding it. You may want to stay at that level, and some occupation-centred approaches, such as co-op, which we'll talk about today, stay at the level of the occupational task. So you assess at the occupational task level, and then your intervention is also focused on those tasks within the context or the environment that the child does them. You can also think about the performance components that underlie the occupational tasks as well. Okay, so when you're using occupation-centred practice, you don't need to ignore those underlying skills. You can pay attention to those, but you need to have a reason to do that. Okay, if you want to know more about the child's memory or their fine motor skills or their cognitive skills, or any of those underlying abilities, you can assess those skills, or you can direct your intervention towards those skills. But you need to be clear that wherever you direct your intervention has an effect on the occupational task. Okay, so you can't assume that by working on fine motor skills, that will make an automatic difference to the child's handwriting, or that if you work on their gross motor skills, that automatically they'll be able to ride a bike. You might think about performance components and underlying skills, but with a particular reason. The key to occupation-centred approaches is that you start with the occupational task and you come back to the occupational task as well. So whatever intervention you use, your evaluation of success is by coming back to the occupational task. If the child can ride the bike, if the child's handwriting actually improves, if the child is able to play with their peers in an appropriate way. Okay, those are your measures of success. That is how you work out if the intervention has been successful. So you begin and you end with the occupational task. So thinking about occupation-centred approaches, in one of the previous presentations, you talked about OT models and other aspects of theory that we use in occupational therapy. So when you're practicing in an occupation-centred manner, you do think in terms of occupational therapy models. In paediatrics, often it's the PEO model. Person, environment, occupation is very popular in paediatrics in Australia because it seems to suit paediatric practice. You will also draw theory from related fields as well. So thinking about frames of reference, for instance. So frames of reference are theoretical frameworks that might come from outside of occupational therapy, but they give you information in order to approach the issue that you're addressing with the child and family. So examples of frames of reference are an acquisitional frame of reference, which we'll talk about more as we continue, or a biomechanical frame of reference. So you might be familiar with a biomechanical frame of reference in looking at the structure and the movement of the body, strength, endurance, those kinds of concepts. So I might blend a biomechanical frame of reference into what I'm doing as an OT by considering the child's pencil grip, which might be a biomechanical component, by considering the child's posture when they're doing work at a desk so that they're able to do that most efficiently and maximise their endurance. So my focus is on the occupational task, being able to complete their work in the classroom, for instance, and that's what my intervention is targeted towards, but I might be thinking partly from a biomechanical frame of reference in looking at their pencil grip and their posture and blending that in. So we can use a range of different frames of reference together. We usually don't pick one and just follow that. And often because we see children with lots of different types of challenges and families with different priorities, we need to draw from different approaches and blend these together. So you've got your occupational therapy model, which goes across everything. You're drawing from your frames of reference, but you're bringing this all into an occupation-centred approach. Another concept there, another type or aspect of related theory is child-centred practice. And in paediatrics, we also talk about family-centred practice. And I know that you've covered some information on that. So that's another example of theory from outside of occupational therapy that we would bring in to inform our occupation-centred practice. So this diagram just gives you a pictorial representation of how the occupational therapy model of practice and the frames of reference might fit together. So you can see that the model of practice is overlying everything else on top of the umbrella. And then the different parts of the umbrella might be the different frames of reference you use: biomechanical, acquisitional, sensory processing. All of those might be different frames of reference that you're bringing together. And then the handle of the umbrella is the approaches that come from that. Today, we're talking about an approach called co-op, or cognitive orientation to occupational performance. And that's an example of an approach that comes from an acquisitional frame of reference. And right down the bottom, your handle of the umbrella are the tools or techniques that you use. So it's just a way of remembering how these different aspects of theory might come together in how you're working. So I mentioned before PEO as an occupational therapy model that we use a lot in paediatrics. So here you can see that the way that you're considering the person, the occupation and the environment is in an overlapping way. And what our main concern is the PEO fit, so where all of those aspects overlap. So if you take the example of a child completing a handwriting task in the classroom, for instance, in an occupation-centred approach, you would want to first gather information in all of those circles. So you would want to know perhaps what is the child's attention like in doing tasks in class? What is their vision and hearing like? Has that been tested? Maybe even what are their general fine motor skills like? How long can they persist at a task? Those are all factors to do with the child or the person. But you would also be gathering information about the occupation. So what type of handwriting tasks are they needing to do? Are they looking at writing sentences or just single words? Are they writing stories and paragraphs? What is the nature of the occupation? Do they need to write within lines, or do they need to write on a worksheet where there are boxes to fill in? Are they needing to copy from a distance or do close-up work? All of those aspects of the occupation and what is expected within their context. You'll also be gathering lots of detailed information about the environment. So in the classroom where they're doing the handwriting task, are they sitting at a desk and facing the front of the room where they're copying from the board? Or are they sitting in a group of children where there is lots more stimulation around them? Are they facing the window where there is stimulation outside the classroom? What are the materials that they have to work at? What is their desk and chair set up? Are their feet able to touch the floor? Do they sometimes need to use different materials and different writing implements? What is the nature of where they keep their books in their desk? Are they set out in a way that's easy to find, or does that sort of create other challenges? So your assessment will be gathering information about all of these aspects. Another aspect of the environment is the teacher. For instance, how is the teacher giving instructions about the handwriting task? And is the child able to understand and process those instructions to be able to complete the task? So that would be an example of where you're looking at all of those factors in gathering information and working out whether there is something going wrong with the PEO fit. You want information from all of those aspects because your intervention might target any of them. Your intervention might be about improving the child's handwriting skills, but your intervention also might include adapting the task. So you colour code the worksheet that the child is using so it's easier for them to keep their place and be able to write neatly in alignment within the parameters of the task.
Leo.
Changing the desk and chair setup that the child has, or changing where the child sits in the classroom so that they can use their vision more effectively for copying from the board. You might ask the teacher to change the instructions that she gives for the handwriting task, or write them on the board so that if the child needs to or gets off track during the task, they're easily able to come back to it. So that is the nature of looking at this through the lens of an occupational therapy model, is that your intervention is about affecting the PEO fit, not just the child themselves. Okay, and in terms of everybody, or buenas noches, it's a more non-directive, motivate the child and family within co-op force as well.
Perdón.
And so it's not just, and really that before you learn to jump. If they're writing quality, then you might decide to, and if you use the task.
Perdón. No sé qué pasó.
So just an example, I talked before about why, then sometimes the parent or the teacher will say, okay, right, I understand. And then they are more likely to take on your recommendations rather than thinking this child has sensory input to be able to focus on what they're doing.
¿En qué parte íbamos, disculpen?
En el modelo PAO.
Minuto 18, un poquito antes.
Disculpen a todos.
Ahí estamos, perfecto.
Aquí, ya, perdón a todos.
That is the nature of looking at this through the lens of an occupational therapy model, is that your intervention is about affecting the PEO fit, not just the child themselves. Okay, and in terms of areas of occupational performance, this slide just gives the main areas of occupational performance that are usually addressed by an occupational therapist. So it helps just to think in terms of when you're first seeing a child, how you're targeting your information gathering, and then how you are, after intervention, evaluating the change. So when you're working in an occupation-centred manner, for instance, your first task is gathering information in some of these areas, and that is guided by what the family and the child want to do, or what are the main concerns for them. So you might look in more depth at self-management, or you might look in more depth at relationships and play and academic skills, depending on what is important for them. It is good to have these range of performance areas in your head so that we can educate the families we work with regarding what are the spheres of concern for occupational therapists, because the families might not know. They might know that we help with academic tasks, but they might not know that we assist with things like play and social relationships and interaction with others. So it's a good sort of overview of what areas of functioning we might deal with. And that is where we start. And often in our reports, for instance, when we document our intervention, we will use headings in the report that mirror these occupational areas. So in my reports, I might have headings that are handwriting, reading, completing tasks in class, playing with peers, riding a bike. All of those could be headings because those are the occupational performance areas that are of concern for the family. And this slide helps to give the therapist a way of putting together our thinking about the occupational performance and the underlying skills and performance components that might contribute to the occupational performance. So when I'm teaching students, for instance, I give them this as a bit of a map of their thinking, of their clinical reasoning, so that they start with gathering information about the occupational performance tasks, and then they hypothesize. So they might hypothesize if the child has difficulty with sport, what might be some of the underlying skills or performance components that might be contributing to that issue. So it may be that the skills that might contribute to that might be gross motor skills. And it may be that the performance components might be things like postural muscle tone or proprioception, those kinds of skills. If the child has difficulty with self-management and being able to stay on task and not get distracted, some of the underlying skills that might contribute to that might be attention or maybe memory. Some of the performance components might be their sensory processing and being able to screen out extraneous information and other sensory input to be able to focus on what they're doing. So this helps to be able to gather information at the top, start with the occupation, and then hypothesize what might be going wrong underneath that. And then you can decide, do I need to assess the child's gross motor skills or their sensory processing, because maybe it contributes to the problem with getting tasks done in the classroom or being able to dress themselves or being able to play sport. But the point is, the reason why you're hypothesizing is because you're individualizing your assessment for each child and you're being guided by their occupational performance concerns. So you wouldn't do the same assessment for every child, focused on their visual perception, their sensory processing, all of those things. You would be guided by what is going wrong with the occupations, what is the concern with the occupations, what types of underlying skills might be making that more difficult. Maybe I need to assess this part and this part, okay? So then you can really focus and target any of that underlying assessment. But you would always be assessing the occupational task itself. So it helps with our reasoning about why we might be assessing certain skills or performance components. So it's okay to do that in an occupational performance, an occupation-centered approach. It's okay to do that as long as you know what role that might play within the occupation. So whether or not you decide to assess those underlying skills and performance components or target them in intervention depends on a number of things. Again, as I said earlier, you would not assume that targeting visual perception will automatically make a difference to the child's reading, or working on gross motor skills will automatically allow them to ride a bike, because the evidence doesn't tell us that that would be the case. But there may be reasons why you want to find out more about those underlying skills. And some of those reasons are on this slide. In my clinical experience, I will find that parents or teachers are maybe more likely to take on your recommendations if they understand why the child is having difficulties. So if they come to you with the child having difficulty concentrating and finishing tasks and being very distracted, they often want to know why. Why is this happening? And if you have done an assessment of their sensory processing and you can say, this is because the child is very sensory sensitive and they are hearing and seeing everything and they can't screen that out, that's the reason why, then sometimes the parent or the teacher will say, okay, right, I understand. And then they are more likely to take on your recommendations rather than thinking this child is naughty or this child isn't listening or this child is lazy. So it's about, it maybe can help you explain why the child is behaving in the way they are. Another reason why you might look at underlying performance components is that you may believe that developing those underlying skills might affect their performance. So you might believe that working on fine motor skills or maybe something like in-hand manipulation, moving things around in your hand might make a difference to the child's ability to do very skilled tasks like tying their shoelaces, for instance. And that's a reasonable assumption. It doesn't have a lot of evidence, but there may be some aspect of those skills that could improve by working on those underlying skills. The main question to ask yourself is, if I work on those underlying skills, will it affect their performance? Try it and evaluate. Is it helping them to tie their shoelaces? Is working on their fine motor skills improving their handwriting? If it is, then fine. But if it's not, then working on those skills is probably not where you would direct your intervention. The third reason why you might assess underlying performance components is that it might impact on the type of strategies you use within the occupational task. So, for instance, if you find that a child has difficulty with spelling and they have trouble recognising words when they see them, and you hypothesize that maybe visual memory might be one of the underlying skills that might contribute to that, and you assess their memory skills and you find that their visual memory is reduced, but their verbal memory or their auditory memory is actually very good, that could be a really useful piece of information, because then the strategies that you will use to help them with spelling might be more auditory strategies, and they might learn songs or rhymes or other ways of remembering the sequence of letters in the word. So in that way, you're using the information that their auditory memory is good in order to use a strategy that you're using within the occupational task. You would not just work on their auditory memory if you're doing occupation-centred practice, but you would use that strategy within the task. So there are some reasons why you might go to that level of skills and performance components, but you need to know why if you're being occupation-centred. And then the way that you evaluate it is by figuring out if it makes a difference within the task. So just an example, I talked before about using different frames of reference and blending those together within an occupation-centred approach. So an example of that is sensory integration or sensory processing. And I also said that you might use some knowledge of those underlying performance components, but use them within the occupational task. So an example of using sensory processing in this way is on this slide. So I've used the term sensory processing because that's the more common term that we tend to use in Australia now. Sensory integration is used more to refer to traditional Jean Ayres sensory integration, and that type of therapy is less used now in its pure form because the evidence for using that purest sensory integration is not as great as the evidence for using occupation-centred approaches. So more so now we use the term sensory processing to encompass more than just sensory integration, but all aspects of sensory processing. For example, sensory modulation is an aspect of sensory processing that we pay attention to. And if you use assessment tools like the sensory processing measure or any of those tools, or the sensory profile, they are really focusing on sensory modulation. And so when we look at that aspect, how the child takes in the and is able to manage the sensory input within their environment in order to alert to information, this is the way that we would tend to use this sensory processing knowledge in contemporary practice. So using techniques that might calm the child or alert the child and help them manage the sensory input around them, and controlling the stimulation in the environment so that you can reduce the child's sensory sensitivity or their sensory seeking behaviour. And there are some examples there on that slide. So changing the environment, using quiet verbal prompts, helping the child have a quiet space in the classroom with less visual stimulation so they're able to focus on what's in front of them, or using earphones or earplugs at times so that you're screening out auditory information that is distracting the child. Those sorts of things, thinking about where they are in the classroom so that there's not a lot of moving stimulus in their range. So all those hanging artwork and that sort of thing in the classroom, changing where that is, and working with the environment and working with the teacher in order to change the environment so it's less distracting for them. Or using something like a fidget toy so that if the child likes to touch and move and get up out of their chair a lot and that sort of thing, being able to replace that stimulation with something else that helps them be able to stay in their seat and helps them be able to participate in the tasks. So those are the aspects of sensory processing that we would more usually include in an occupation-centred approach. And you can see that it's occupation-centred because all of those strategies that I mentioned are within the child's natural context, and they're relevant to the occupational task that they're doing. Okay, they're not sort of separately trying to build skills to do with their sensory processing. It's within the task. So another example of that, if you can think about some of those sensory integration concepts like proprioception, bilateral integration, motor planning, what we would do in an occupation-centred approach is think about what is the effect of those underlying skills on the task, and then we would use strategies to address the effect of those. So if the child writes, only on one side of the page because they're having trouble crossing the midline, which is a sensory integration concept, I would notice that as a therapist.
Leo, ahora vamos a hacer un pequeño stop porque vamos a cambiar voy a parar compartiendo, vamos a traspasarnos ahora a YouTube. Leo, ¿puedes empezar a compartir tú?
Tú tienes que dejar de compartir primero, Jenny.
Perdón. Quería contarles mientras que Leo pone la grabación en YouTube, que un poco tras bambalinas, este video lo grabamos hace una semana, y para poder mejorar la calidad, porque cuando uno pone videos en YouTube se pierde un poco la calidad de la presentación, entonces la diapositiva que está detrás no se ve claramente, como vamos a ver ahora. Para poder intentar arreglarlo, compré un programa y empecé a hacer los subtítulos, pero estos subtítulos que ustedes acaban de ver y que además estaban desfasados, pido perdón por eso, en algunas partes me demoré 4 días en hacer 30 minutos y la presentación dura 1 hora 40, por lo tanto tuve que hacerla, después decidí por salud mental, porque me estaba volviendo loca, ponerlo en YouTube, así que eso es lo que vamos a ver ahora. Eso, espero que se vea bien. Ya, Leo, cuando quieras.
¿El volumen?
Leo, y cuando compartes,
¿Ahora sí?
perdón,
Sí.
cuando compartes hay una opción en Zoom que dice optimizar el audio o como conectar el audio por internet. Cuando pinchas la opción share, hay una cuestión que dice cómo optimizar el video y el audio de la...
Ah, ya. Sonido de
para
la
que el
computadora.
audio vaya internamente por el computador y no salga y vuelva a entrar por los audífonos.
Ok, ahí estamos.
Perfecto. Recuerden que pueden hacer sus preguntas y las vamos a recoger todas desde YouTube y Zoom.
¿Se visualiza mi pantalla?
Sí.
Sí.
Ok, vamos.
If you can think about some of those sensory integration concepts like proprioception, bilateral integration, motor planning, what we would do in an occupation-centered approach is think about what is the effect of those underlying skills on the task, and then we would use strategies to address the effect of those. So if the child writes, only on one side of the page because they're having trouble crossing the midline, which is a sensory integration concept, I would notice that as a therapist, but I wouldn't work on their bilateral integration. What I would do is provide cues within the task to help them cross the midline so that they can do the task. So put maybe a green margin on one side, green for go, red margin on the other side, red for stop, so that the child has a visual cue when they get to the end of the line, I need to go back to the beginning. So you're using cues within the task. If you think that the child has a very sort of floppy posture because of low muscle tone, low postural tone, which is a frequent issue we see, maybe, and that's impacting on their handwriting because they really have trouble sitting up and they haven't got very much endurance and it affects their writing quality, then you might decide to do preparatory tasks to increase their muscle tone before they do handwriting. So when they come home from school, they might ride their bike for a while, which is giving them vestibular input to be able to then do the task and maintain their posture while they're doing a handwriting task. Or in therapy, you might do weight bearing or other vestibular activities, but you're doing it immediately before sitting down at the desk and doing the handwriting task or doing the other tasks that they need to do that are relevant to their occupations and their occupational roles. So those are just some examples where you might be drawing from sensory integration concepts, but you're bringing in other frames of reference and other approaches to address the problem within an occupation-centered framework. Okay, so now we'll talk about a particular occupation-centered approach that's called COOP, Cognitive Orientation to Occupational Performance. And this is an approach that, as you can see from the definition there, is focused on being very performance-based, and it's focused on problem-solving, a problem-solving approach that is really about acquiring skills and helping the child to acquire skills. And this approach fits within an acquisitional frame of reference. I'll tell you later about the research that's been done on this approach over the last almost 2 decades, but in the early 2000s was the initial work on COOP, and it was developed initially to work with children with developmental coordination disorder, but it has expanded since then to be relevant to other client groups as well. So COOP is an approach, so it's like the handle of the umbrella, and it fits within an acquisitional frame of reference like I was mentioning before. So an acquisitional frame of reference is different to a developmental frame of reference, and any of you who are paediatric therapists will be used to a developmental frame of reference where we think about skills being acquired along a developmental continuum. So you can't learn to hop before you learn to jump. You can't walk before you crawl, those sorts of things. An acquisitional frame of reference doesn't think about that continuum, that developmental continuum, because all of the children that we see don't always develop skills along a developmental continuum. And we can't assume that if they have a developmental delay that they will catch up. Okay, you will know as therapists, pediatric therapists, that this often doesn't happen, that there is a particular difficulty or impairment that's interrupting their ability to master the task. So an acquisitional frame of reference really more emphasizes the continuum of simple skills to complex skills. So it assumes that you can master, you can acquire a skill even if it's not in the developmental sequence. You may need to develop more simple skills before you master more complex skills, but you're still able to master them. And this slide also shows that co-op is not the only approach that fits within an acquisitional frame of reference. There are other examples there, such as the 4-quadrant model of facilitated learning, also developed by an occupational therapist, Craig Grieber, and occupational performance coaching, developed by an occupational therapist, Fiona Graham. So those are other examples. So today we'll just talk about co-op. But remember that also most therapists won't just use co-op. Okay, you can use co-op as a separate approach and a complete approach and just use co-op. Most therapists will blend together techniques from co-op and some of the other frames of reference or approaches that they use, but still be occupation-centred. So an acquisitional frame of reference really comes from learning theories that are drawn from mainly psychology in the 50s, 60s and 70s. So theorists like Vygotsky, for instance, that is the genesis of where an acquisitional frame of reference has come from. But it comes from 2 principal learning strategies. And what you're thinking about when you're using an acquisitional frame of reference is that it's based on the process of teaching and learning and also analysis of the task or analysis of performance. So it's not just about teaching and learning. That aspect of task analysis, performance analysis is really uniquely suited to occupational therapy because we have particular skills in that area. So it's blending together that performance and activity analysis with the teaching and learning that is what is uniquely OT. And really that approach to practice is not completely new because in previous decades, in the 60s and 70s, that was much more popularised, not in the form it is now, and nobody talked about occupation-centred practice then, but it was something that was drawn upon more in the early stages of occupational therapy within Australia and some of the other Western countries. And it was used for cognitive and motor deficits there. Now it's formulated into a different approach that was specifically targeted towards clients with developmental coordination disorder. But the main thing there is those 2 principles that you're working from. And really it emerged because we needed to have a different paradigm to understand children who had motor-based performance problems, because our approaches such as sensory integration that were popular in previous decades or other ways of targeting the underlying skills weren't necessarily having the outcomes that we expected in terms of the child acquiring skills. So co-op was therefore developed as a response to that so that we could more directly target occupation and the underpinning of those psychological theories and teaching and learning approach really shows how that can come together in a theoretically sound manner. It assumes that new skills can be mastered from an interaction of the child, the task, and the environment. So that's another thing that's uniquely OT about these types of approaches, because co-op is thinking about the child and the occupation and the environment, like the PEO model, not just about fixing the child, not just about changing the child's skills, but also targeting what we're doing to the task and the environment, which is what occupational therapy is uniquely about. Okay, so the thing to think about with co-op is that it's a top-down approach, so it begins with the role or the task or the end product, whatever that might be, being able to play with friends, being able to do my schoolwork, being able to tie my shoelaces, being able to use a knife and fork, being able to stay on the task for, you know, the length of the task and finish it. It begins with the occupational task. And the key aspect of the child mastering the task is that the child discovers the strategies that allow that mastery. So therefore, it's a more non-directive way of working. And we are often, as pediatric therapists, we are often used to working in a very directive way and being very structured about what we ask the child to do and making a lot of those decisions. So coming up with what is going to be the best way of doing the task and then showing the child how to do it and getting them to practice that. Co-op is not like that. Co-op is really, for very good reasons, focused on the child coming up with and discovering the strategies that will allow the mastery. So it's very non-directive. So one of the challenges is learning how to work in a non-directive way. So the objectives that we're looking at are, I'll go to the second one first. Skill acquisition is probably the main objective of what you're doing with co-op, for the child to be able to ride the bike or be able to write the story or be able to tie their shoelaces. But when it was first introduced, some OTs would say, but doesn't that mean that the child will just learn that skill? What about all the other skills? What about all the other things they need to master? And so it's not just acquiring that skill. We sometimes used the phrase splinter skilling. I don't know if that's a phrase that you use, but the idea that you might just learn this one skill and then that's not helping the child with all the other things that they're likely to have difficulties with. But what we know is that co-op is not just about training the child to ride the bike. It's also about that first objective, which is developing cognitive strategies. So being able to come up with the problem-solving strategies and a way of approaching the task that allows them to then learn new strategies and learn new ways of thinking about mastering tasks that they then can apply to other tasks that they do. So it's not just that one skill that they learn, but they're learning more cognitive strategies that they are applying to other tasks, and that helps with generalization and transfer. So you might be focusing on one particular goal in co-op, but the intention is that the child is then going to be able to apply what they learn in that process to other goals and other tasks as well. So the techniques that are important in co-op are these four techniques here, which I'll go through in detail. So child-chosen goals, dynamic performance analysis, which is your main form of assessment in a co-op approach, the cognitive strategies that you come up with, and the technique of guided discovery. So firstly, child-chosen goals. So within co-op, and again, I just want to emphasize that all of these techniques, as I said before, if you're using co-op in a pure way, you will do all of this in a very set sort of program. But many, many, many therapists will use each of these techniques in different combinations in other ways when they're doing therapy. So even if you're not doing co-op, you will often also use child-chosen goals for particular reasons. So in co-op, you're using child-chosen goals so that the child has a voice in what they're working on in therapy, and it is something that they are motivated towards, and it's something that is meaningful to them. So we can sometimes use tools like the COPM or PEGS, which you can see on the screen here. So PEGS is the Perceived Efficacy and Goal Setting System. So PEGS is a tool that uses, it's like a card sort, so it has pictures of different occupational tasks that the child might do, and the child classifies these according to how well they think they do the task and how important they think the task is to them. So by doing this, you will end up with goals that are phrased in language that is meaningful to the child and that the child understands. So if you can see down the bottom of the slide there, the goals you might come up with, like write better, dress by myself in the morning, ride my bicycle without stopping. And you also have there the reasons why that is important to the child. So they want to write better so that they can finish in time in the classroom and they're not left behind, or they're not taking longer than their friends. She wants to dress by herself so she's got time to watch TV before she goes to school. Not because it's important to dress by myself because everyone else thinks it's important, but because it has meaning to me as a child. She wants to ride her bicycle so she can ride alongside her sister and maybe beat her in a race. So the meaning of the goal has to be clear to the child, not just to the adults around them. Having said that, there is also the opportunity within co-op for there to be goals that the parent and the teacher also contribute to, because what you might be thinking is that if the child gets to choose all the goals, maybe they won't want to do the things that are harder for them. Maybe they won't want to do the tasks that they actually need to master because it's what's expected of them at school or at home. But you can negotiate within this system so that there are maybe 2 goals that are the child's goals and 2 that are the parent's goals, or that are contributed to by the teacher, so that there is some negotiation of all of those goals being important. At least some of the goals in there are from the child. So one of the reasons why goal setting, and that particularly the child's involvement in goal setting, is really critical to an occupation-centred approach, is because it fits with our philosophy of family-centred practice. So I know you've talked about client-centred practice in previous presentations. In paediatrics, we extend that to the family as well. And there is a body of knowledge and a body of research that supports family-centred practice as being central to achieving more long-lasting outcomes and more effective outcomes that are meaningful to the people that you're working with. So some of these concepts, like parents being the experts on their own children, being able to participate in the decision making, are very central to approaches like co-op, but also other approaches that we use if we're doing occupation-centred practice. So where you're beginning in your therapy and in your assessment is on focusing on the values and needs and priorities of the family. And what you do and the way you do it in therapy is important to underpin family-centred practice. So things like using what we call user-friendly language or lay language to communicate, making sure that the goals that you're setting, that you're, I guess, not choosing to focus on lots and lots of different goals at the beginning, but that it's not overwhelming to the family, that you're beginning with what's most important to them, and they can see the connection between what you're working on in therapy and what is important to them in daily life. So again, it's beginning and ending with what is important to them. And I think in a later presentation, you'll talk about self-determination theory, which will explain more about why things like goal setting and other aspects of family-centered practice are really critical in order to motivate the child and family and to ensure that the outcomes you're getting are actually making a difference in daily life and are sustainable over time. So that's just a little note to say where goal setting fits. And this slide shows you that there are quite a lot of assessments or tools that we have available to us in different aspects of the child's occupational roles. So in terms of leisure, in terms of productivity, all of those areas, in terms of self-care, all of those areas that you can draw upon to get more information to help with goal setting. But what I want to stress is that all of these tools are really about, like I said at the beginning, gaining a really clear occupational picture of what is happening with the child in their context. And I know a lot of therapists who don't have access to all of these tools, maybe even hardly any of these tools. And you can still do family-centered goal setting and child-centered goal setting through your interview skills and through the usual processes that you would do in therapy without using a formalized tool if they are not available to you. The key thing is that you are using an occupation-centered approach by getting information about what's important and critical and meaningful to the family. Even one tool like the COPM, which you may have been introduced to, but will come up in future presentations, which is an occupational performance measure, the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure. Even just that one tool, which is actually accessible to you a bit more easily, would be enough to be able to assist with goal setting, with family-centered goal setting. And often we can do it without that even. So I don't want that. I don't want the availability of tools that are in Spanish language to be a barrier to you using occupation-centered practice, because there are definitely ways that you can do that, and many therapists here in Australia will not always use these tools because we all have limited time in our clinical caseload. So we'll often try to build some of these tools into the processes, but sometimes it's not able to happen every time, and that's okay. You can still be occupation-centered. So in terms of assessment then, if we think about goal setting and assessment for goal setting, and assessment to help you figure out what to directly do in intervention, there is the concept of dynamic performance analysis. So this is a process, an observation-based process that is particularly used in co-op, but you can use it outside of co-op as well, that is really about analysing the child's occupational performance while they're doing the task. And that is the key aspect, that's the main aspect of your assessment, because you're starting your assessment at the occupational performance level. Like I said before, you might later on go on decide I need to assess memory, or I need to assess fine motor skills, or I need to assess sensory processing, but you start with dynamic performance analysis. And your key aim is in observing performance and figuring out where is the breakdown in the performance of the task.
Is the same. I don't know where the other one was. Do you want me to search the other one?
No, that's okay. Do you want me to just keep going from here?
Yeah.
And you can splice it together somehow.
Yeah.
It'll work.
Yes.
So dynamic performance analysis is about discovering where is the breakdown in the task. And really, that breakdown could be about the child's performance, but it also needs to consider the environment that the occupational task is performed within and the occupational task itself. So while you're looking at the performance of the task and while you're trying to detect the performance breakdown, you're considering all of those aspects together. Again, you can see how the PEO model really fits with this, right? Because you're figuring out what is the breakdown. And the breakdown is assumed to be an interaction of the child's performance, the environment, and the task. It's not just about, you would never say the breakdown is the child's fine motor skills, because the breakdown would be the child not knowing how to form the loops of the shoelace in order to then complete that part of the task, or the way that the task is set up being difficult for the child to, or creating more challenges for the child to do that task because of the environment or because of the activity itself. So you're looking at all of those aspects together when you're doing dynamic performance analysis. So this is what the decision tree looks like for dynamic performance analysis. And you can see there, without going through it in great detail, that what you're looking at is, as I said, where in the performance is the breakdown. And there are a few different places to look at. You might discover as you're observing the task that the child doesn't know exactly what to do, that the child's knowledge of the task might be reduced. So this brings into our reasoning the idea that there might be some parts of the task that the child hasn't grasped, that they haven't learned, that they need to more explicitly learn. And that's what's getting in the way. So they might not have learned the way that you actually hold a fork so that you control it. And so they're just doing that the way that they assume they need to do, but they don't have that knowledge of the task. And then it also points you towards, does the client have the ability to do it? So they might know, I need to hold the fork in that way in order to control it, because that's what I see my mum and my dad doing, but I can't make that happen. I can't move my hand and plan my movement in a way that that will happen. So maybe they can't do the task. So it helps you to figure out, is it about the knowledge of the task? Is it about the ability of doing it? Or is it about the occupational demands or supports? You know, are there aspects to do with the task that need to be changed? Is the environment that the child is doing the task in, is that something that needs to be changed? Are they trying to do their handwriting at a desk that is this high, or maybe try to using the knife and fork? Are they trying to use their knife and fork at the adult's table with their arms up like this and not able to get any control of what they're doing because of the environment? So you will look at all of those aspects in order to figure out where is the breakdown. And sometimes it's quite surprising where the breakdown is. Okay, so the next aspect, so we've talked about the child-centered or child-chosen goals. We've talked about the dynamic performance analysis, and now we're going to talk about cognitive strategies. So the cognitive element of co-op, of cognitive orientation, is about learning to think about what you need to do and learning to think about how you do it. And so there's two types of cognitive strategies that are relevant to co-op. There's a global strategy, a global problem-solving strategy we use, and then there are what is called domain-specific strategies. So working through those, the global problem-solving strategy in co-op is called goal, plan, do, check. And this is a technique that you will see therapists use in all sorts of other contexts, even when they're not doing co-op, when a child is trying to master a task. So it's the idea that there is a framework that you keep coming back to that makes sense to the child. You help them to define their goal, and you help them to keep their goal in the front of their mind. So maybe the goal is, I want to tie my shoelaces. So you'll keep bringing them back to the goal. Then the plan is really involving discussion and talking about what you're going to try in order to do that. So I want to tie my shoelaces. What will I try next? You'll come up with a plan together, and then the doing is that the child executes that plan. They try, they experiment, they try the task using their plan. So there's a lot of talking in the plan stage, but I'll talk more about how you do that discussion. It's so that the child comes up with the plan. You don't give them the plan, the child comes up with the plan, and you design your discussion with them so that they come up with an idea that they try. That plan may work or it might not work, and that's okay, because the child needs to discover what works. So they will do the task involving that plan or executing that plan, and then you will help them to evaluate. So it's really trying their plan and evaluating, has it worked? Hasn't it worked? What will we do now? Okay, so then you come back to the beginning again. So this is the framework that goes across all the activities that you might do. And this slide just shows a pictorial representation of that. So you can see that it's a cyclical process. It's not a linear process. It's something that you keep coming in any one session of therapy. You might come back to goal plan, do check multiple times, 10 times, 5 times, in order to trial out different strategies. And each time the child goes through the goal plan, do check, it changes their cognitive awareness of what's working and what they might do differently in order to master the task. So as they go around that process in a cyclical way, they're getting closer and closer to mastering the task, but they're discovering what it is they're trying each time. So then the domain-specific strategies are those mechanisms at that micro level of how you help the child through the goal plan, do check. So you don't just talk about, it's not just all talking about what's your goal, what's your plan, and doing it. There's lots of strategies that you will recognise as experienced OTs that you will draw from, that you've probably used a lot, that come into assisting them to be able to be successful at the task. So going through these one by one, here's a list of the different types of strategies. That's what it really means by domain-specific strategies, the types of different strategies that you can apply to help the child master the task. So working through each of these separately, the first one is body position. So we all know as occupational therapists that the process of feeling the movement helps the child to get the proprioceptive feedback they need to be able to plan the movement again. I'm talking in terms of motor tasks, but you might also use this in terms of feeling the performance of what you're doing. So if it's a different type of task and not a motor task, this would also apply. It's about feeling what that feels like to do it in this way. So in terms of body position, for instance, if the child is doing a task at the desk, it might be about questioning them about where their body is in relation to the table. So bringing to their awareness if the child is sitting right away from the table or if they're right up close to the table, and that's really hampering their ability to control their pencil for handwriting, you might draw that to attention. How close is your body to the table? Where would you want it to be? Where would your bottom be on the chair to make you feel like you're really sitting and you're feeling solid and you're feeling able to keep going? And you might do some of that questioning, and at the end of that process, one of the strategies might be about the body position. So the child is thinking, okay, when I get ready for writing, I'm going to glue my back to the chair, or I'm going to line up my belly button with the middle of my book, okay, because this might be a child that twists their body and doesn't align their work, and that's really getting in the way of what they're doing. So you're drawing their attention to their body position, and they're discovering, okay, I need to do this in a different way. And at the end of that, we'll come up with a simple strategy that will help them do the task differently in order to master it. So body position is one aspect. Okay, the next one is task specification modification, which is a mouthful. So this is about thinking about and discussing verbally what are the aspects of the task, the different specifics or the parameters of the task, the key parts of the task that I need to pay attention to in order to get success. So some examples might be if you're going through the goal plan, do, check process, and the child has decided that this is where I need to stand in order to swing the cricket bat and make the ball go straight. Or this is where I need to stand or how I need to stand in order to kick the soccer ball. Then there might be a cue of, okay, this foot needs to be here, this foot needs to be there. How are we going to remember that? Let's put some tape on the floor to help you know how to do that. Or if they're having difficulty with handwriting and knowing what are the short letters and what are the tall letters, drawing attention to those key features of the task, that all of the tall letters start at the top of the line, start at this line here. So that's like a rule that they come up with that helps them to specify how you're going to master that task. Doing spaces between the words. So every time I finish a word, I put my little finger down. We call it a pinky. I can't remember what you call it, but we call it a pinky. Enrique. Enrique?
Yes.
Yeah. Put my finger down before I write the next word to create a space. So it's about really drilling down to the key features of the task, how you need to specify a particular task. And you will know where to focus that discussion because you've done your dynamic performance analysis, and you can see that every time they write the tall letters, they start in the same place as the small letters. So they're not cueing in to that specific aspect of the task. So you need to draw that to their attention. Here's an example that we use really frequently in our therapy. So the car is driving around the M, starting at the green light and finishing at the red light. So that's a really clear example of task specification for the child. Where does the letter start? Where does it stop? What is the path that it drives on?
I will add an example, Jody.
Yes.
Lo que he visto yo en las experiencias en los colegios es que usan harto como la similaritud entre un semáforo. Entonces, por ejemplo, cuando escriben las letras, en lugar que yo he visto algunos ejemplos en español que han sido publicados, pero usan 2 puntos verdes. Entonces, al usar un punto verde y un punto rojo en donde se inicia la letra y en donde yo termino, hace que los niños tengan una orientación clara de dónde empiezo y hacia dónde voy, en lugar de poner 2 puntos que no les dan más claves de cómo seguir la tarea. Entonces, como ejemplos cotidianos de hacer un símil con el semáforo los ayuda a orientarse en términos de cómo poder escribir la letra. That's it.
One day I will be able to speak Spanish that well, if you all help me. You might have to cut this bit out.
Perdón por la interrupción. Es porque Jody está viendo una presentación en inglés mientras grabamos la en español.
So the next strategy, the next domain-specific strategy is supplementing task knowledge. So this is about actually increasing the child's awareness or understanding of how to do the task. So being aware that children who have motor difficulties or have any difficulties with task mastery will often lack sufficient knowledge about the specifics of the task. So this is about the knowledge. So having some of that or discovering some of that information that, you know, we always start writing on the left side of the page, or this is how we make a capital A. So the knowledge of the task and making sure that the child has the information they need in order to do the task. So it's sort of related to task specification, but task specification is a little bit more about providing the cues that the child needs to notice those specifics. This is about the knowledge that they need, the understanding that they need about the task, about how to do the task. The next one is feeling the movement. So this is drawing the child's attention. We talked about body position before, but this is drawing the child's attention to how the movement feels. So as they're doing the task, getting them to pay attention to what it feels like to form that letter, or what it feels like to push the button through the hole. How does that feel? What does it feel like when you hold your knife and fork and push down with the fork and saw with the knife? How does that feel? So that they're getting some of that awareness of the feeling of the movement and bringing that to consciousness. And that will eventually then be converted or will grow into some of the strategies that the child can use to help themselves with the motor performance. So the example of a child pressing very hard with their pencil, which we see very frequently, if they're paying attention to what it feels like, and then we experiment. So now we're going to press heavy like an elephant. Now we're going to try pressing light like a feather or like a fairy, if whatever appeals to the child. And so then when they learn what it feels like, the cue of I need to press as light as a feather is something that will impact on the way that they do the task. So that understanding and that feeling of the movement, if they cue themselves about that, that translates into their motor performance, because it's tapping into their motor memory as well. And then the last couple are verbal motor mnemonics, and then there's another verbal rote script. So this is about really finding easy ways with very simple child-friendly language for the child to remember what they need to do and how they need to do the task. So you've done the feeling of the movement of what it feels like to do an S, which is often a letter that's difficult to do. So now it's about attaching something verbal to that so that the child can easily remember that and associate what they need to do with something that they can easily recall. So usually these sorts of verbal motor mnemonics things that the child needs to come up with. So you would ask the child, so that's how it feels to form that S. What does it remind you of? What do you think it looks like that would help you remember how to do it? Sometimes we can do that with words as well, or with any concept really. So, you know, this child might say it looks like a dollar sign. So another child might say it looks like a snake. Another child might say it looks like a worm. Another child might say something different from their experience. The point is that they come up with what it is. So I need to do it like a snake. You know, anything that's going to help them to remember how they do it and has meaning to them.
I will say another example.
Yes.
Jody. Otro ejemplo que yo había visto es, y que es súper bonito e interesante, es respecto de la orientación de las letras. Por ejemplo, cuando los niños escriben la V o la D al revés. Entonces hay un dibujo en que uno pone el sol a un lado y le explica que la letra B va a estar escondiendo la guatita del sol porque si no se quema, mientras que la letra D le gusta mirar el sol porque está con la guatita hacia el sol. Entonces ese tipo de dibujos o explicaciones hacen que para los niños sea mucho más fácil entender la orientación. Y les recuerdo, está escribiendo una B, la B se esconde del sol porque se quema la guatita. Eso.
I'll give you another example actually that shows the difference between different children and why in this approach you want the child to come up with it. So think about the child writing on lines and knowing what line to write on and which lines to write within. So I remember sometimes we talk about, having the grass and the sky and the high letters starting in the sky and the tail letters like G and Y going under the ground and that sort of thing. I remember one child was very much into volcanoes. So they wanted to talk about where the ash was and where the lava was and where was the smoke in the sky. And that's what helped them remember where they need to start the letters because it was personal to them. So it makes a big difference if it's not imposed by the therapist or by the adult, but is something that the child comes up with. And then the final strategy there, domain-specific strategy, is verbal rote script. I find this is really, really useful. And if you think about the way that children learn complex motor tasks, it really draws upon that learning process. When any of us need to learn something new that is complex, if we learn how to do Latin dancing, maybe, like me, this is hard for me, not hard for you, hard for me, then you would talk yourself through together, forward, side, together. Even adults do that when they learn something new. So this is the idea that the child has a rote pattern of words to guide their motor planning. If they verbalize it, it assists their motor planning, but it needs to be short, it needs to be brief and only key words. So playing basketball, dribble, dribble, shoot, or swinging a bat. So lean back and forward through, or doing forming an A, around, up and down. Sometimes we will say to children, you need to tell your pencil what to do because your pencil is not listening to you. So it helps if they can verbalize. If they can't, if they find that difficult, then you can verbalize for them, but it can be more effective if the child can verbalize. So it needs to be really, really simple. And you can see that there are sometimes imaginative concepts that are built into this as well, so that they're making things into pictures or thinking about associating it with something they know. And that's part of their verbal rote script. So as a summary, you might end up with a range of strategies for this child that are all on one page, that are the things they need to remember. So here are some examples of what equipment they might use. This is something that they've come to after the process of Gold Plan Do Check, trying out different things and discovering what works. And so then these are the final strategies that they're going to put into practice within the task as they're doing it at class or as they're doing it at school or at home. And I think that this shows how important the occupational therapy process is to this. So when you first think about approaches like co-op or clients, occupation-centered practice, you might think, isn't that just like teaching the child to do a task like a teacher would do? No, it is not. Because if you look at these strategies, there's been a lot of occupational analysis and a lot of strategy development and discovery that has gone into getting to this point of what strategies are going to work with the child. If you were just teaching the task like a teacher would, you would use the same way of teaching the task. Okay, because that is the way the task is taught. This is about working with the child's individual strengths and challenges and individual interests and motivation to be able to work out how they can master the task. And it involves a lot of unique occupational therapy skills. Okay, and then the final key concept or key technique in co-op is guided discovery. Again, guided discovery is one of those techniques that a lot of therapists use in lots of different aspects of therapy, even when they're not doing formal co-op. So this is the idea that children will use a strategy best if they discover it themselves and if they give it a name rather than you giving it a name. So you take on the role as an intermediary between the child and the task. And so guided discovery is really the key aspect of co-op that is non-directive, where you're taking a different role. So the important things to remember here, and this slide just summarises them, is that you ask, you don't tell. You don't give the child the instruction, you ask them a question. Sometimes when I teach students about this, I call it the I wonder approach, because you often take on the demeanour of saying, I wonder why that didn't work. What could we do differently? And it has the effect of asking the child's opinion, which automatically adds value to the child and shows respect for the child and makes the child feel more competent because you're asking for their ideas, and every child likes to be asked for their ideas, right? So you're asked these questions in a curious manner. And that's how I explain it to students, because it helps them to think about having a curious demeanour rather than a I'm in charge demeanour. So you ask, don't tell, lots of questions around that. You focus on one thing at a time so that the child works on a strategy and decides whether or not it's working or not. And then they might try another strategy. So don't try to change two things at once, because then the child isn't discovering what's working. Okay, if they do the task in a particular way, throw the ball in this way, and then change it completely to a completely different way, they're not learning what has worked. And they need to be conscious of what's worked, because that's the point. So you coach, you don't change things for them. So if they're not succeeding, don't move the target so that they get it. Coach them about what they might need to do differently. Do you think we should put that closer or further away? Do you think we should change the type of pencil we're using rather than change it for them? But coach them to think about what could change. And you also want to make it obvious to them. So there's ways of using yourself in guided discovery so that you're raising the child's awareness of what might be a good thing to try without directly telling them. You're hinting at it. You're making it sort of obvious to them by the way you're discussing it or what you're doing, but you're not telling them directly because they need to discover it. So some of the micro techniques that you can use within guided discovery are listed here and on the next slide. So there's a few specific techniques that you apply, and in a minute we'll have a look at a video and I can point some of them out to you. But just to describe these, process questioning is where you're asking the child, what's the problem? So what hasn't worked there? You're actually getting them to sort of think about what is working and not working, and come up with what might be worth trying. So you do that over and over and over again in guided discovery. The technique of bridging is where you might bring into the child's awareness what's happened the last time they did it and what we could do differently, and then what you might see when you do something different. So you're helping them to pay attention to what happened last time when we did this. Did that work? okay, so now we're going to try something different. So what we might be expecting to happen is this. Okay, last time we did it, it wasn't very accurate. So if we change it and do this, then we might think that it might be more accurate. So that's what we're looking to change. We want it to be more accurate. So, you know, when we do our letters this way, do they look neat? Do they stay in a line? No, when we did it that way, they didn't. So if we try this, let's see if, you know, they come up with the idea of highlighting the line so that it stands out to them. So if this works this time, we're going to see that it's all in a straight line and it looks neat. That's what we expect will happen. So you're helping them to bridge those past and future experiences, because children won't necessarily always pay attention to that, or might not have cued into or noticed what hasn't gone right the last time. So bridging, and then comparison and describing. So just getting them to sort of say more about what the task bring to consciousness, what the task looked like, and notice all of the details of the task. And then there's modelling, where the therapist might actually do the task, but in contrast to how you would do it in a more directive type of therapy, where you would show the child how to do it properly, what you might do is to try it, but not do it in a way that is successful, in order to draw the child's attention to what's not working. So the example there is a child might write the sentence with no spaces, so it's all kind of squashed together, and then say, so what do you think of that? Have I done a good job? And it's up to the child to work out, no, I can't tell where the words are. Well, why can't you? And the child comes, oh, there's no spaces. Oh, what can I do about that? So sometimes the therapist can kind of take a naive approach to model or to highlight something particular to the child. So they might do it in a way that the child does it, but it's to highlight to the child what needs to happen differently. And then there's challenging or requiring justification. So not taking at face value what's working. So if the child decides that something is working, you as the therapist might ask them, why? Why do you think that's working? What's different that makes you think that that's working? So that the child might try something, and as children want to feel that they have succeeded, they might say, yeah, that's better, that's much better, I think I've done better. And you might need to challenge them and say, in a very supportive way, you might need to say, so what's different about it? And help them really evaluate. So that's about helping them to notice and really evaluate what's really happened, rather than what they want to see has happened. And then the last one there is reflection or elaborated feedback. So I guess helping the child to summarise, okay, so we did it this way. Now let's think, what were the things that helped? So what are the take-home messages that then will lead to your strategies of, okay, so every time I do this, I need to do this and this and this. So like those strategies that we had on the slide before, that's the end product of that, helping the child to summarise and remember, okay, what I've learned is that I need to make sure I press as light as a feather, and that I bring my chair so that my book faces my belly button, and that, you know, all of those things. So you're helping them to then bring together and make a judgment on what has worked. So all of these are really facilitating and scaffolding their cognitive skills or their cognitive strategy development. So what we might do now is have a quick look at a video of someone using co-op, and I can show you and point out some of these strategies that are being used.
I got 60, 70, 80.
You got 3 on
90, okay. 50, 60, 70, 80. 8 times.
That's right. So your goal was to get all of the rings on.
Yeah.
How many did you get on that time?
I got most of them. I got 3 of them.
3 of them.
So I just have to get 2 more.
That's right. So what are you going to do differently this time?
I'm going to stand further back.
So you think standing further back will help you to get more?
Because then if I go further.
So that was an example of process questioning. So that's a student there. So the student is talking through with the child, what was your goal? What happened? What are you going to do now? Oh, so you think doing that is going to help with your goal, which is getting the rings on the stick. So that's an example of process questioning.
Let's see this from here.
Okay, let's see how it goes. Standing further back.
Now, we'll move this.
Right there. Wow.
Maybe it's going to get to the side.
Let's try this plan. Standing further back. Okay, so how many did you get on that time? So, how do you think you're planning? So does standing further back help you get more on?
Well, not more, but it actually helps me.
Get that one on?
Okay, a little bit further.
How does standing further back help you, Erin?
I don't know, it just does.
How can you tell it helps you?
Because I normally get more on. That's why.
So when you stood further back, you got less on.
But when I was closer, I got 0 on it. Stepped back, I got 1 for mine.
Right. When you step back, you've got 1 on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes when you're up close, you've got 1 on too. Erin, sometimes when you're up close, you've got 1 on. And sometimes when you stood back, you've got 1 on as well.
Yep.
So do you think how far away you stand makes any difference? If when you're up close, you get 1.
Maybe I should step 2 steps closer.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's something different.
Yes.
Let's have another go.
So that was an example of firstly challenging or requiring justification. So the child was saying that his strategy of standing further back worked, and the therapist challenged him and said, but when you stood closer up, you got the same amount on as further back. So she was giving him information to help him to really evaluate what had occurred, and she challenged his assumption that it had worked. And then she actually gave more elaborated feedback. So she talked about what things helped or hindered and helped his awareness of what had helped or hindered his performance. And he ended up saying, maybe I need to try something new. So she kept going with some of those techniques until he had that awareness, and then he was able to make a different plan. Okay, so we might just move forward to, I think it was 3:30? 3 or 3? Yeah, there. Ah.
How did you throw it? Like this? Yeah. Okay. Like this. Now, did you notice that 2 of them went on that time?
Yes.
So here the therapist's going to have a go.
What are you doing differently to the ones that you know? You know? Or is it just luck? Okay. Watch me. Let's see. I want to see if you give me some tips. Okay, ready?
The second last one was better because
So that was a good example of modelling, because the therapist first said, I'm going to have a go and I want to see if you can give me some tips. And then you could see that she very overtly used a particular technique that she knew wasn't going to be successful, that she had seen him do, but without saying that she'd seen him do it. She modelled that, and then she, in the middle of that, did the task in a different way that was successful. So she emphasised it, overly emphasised it, to make it obvious. So I think in one of the earlier slides we talked about making it obvious. So she modelled that in order to make it obvious to the child what was part of his technique that might be underpinning success or helping success. So those are just a few examples of what that might look like. Okay, so thinking about co-op, what we know, and you can probably envisage this now that you've seen some of the techniques and what it looks like, is that obviously it requires that there is some kind of discussion that you can have with the child. And so non-verbal children, you can't really use this particular approach with. You can still use occupation-centred approaches with non-verbal children, but you might not be able to use co-op with non-verbal children. But sufficient language doesn't need to mean that they have language that is within typical parameters for typically developing children. They can definitely have some language disorders or language difficulties. It just means that the type of discussion you have with them is suits or matches their level of language, but that you do need to be able to discuss some aspects of what they're going to do because it's reasonably verbal. The ability to pay attention to some extent, the ability to set goals, the motivation of the child may be important. However, I have used co-op or aspects of co-op with many children who have had difficulty with motivation or who have had difficult behaviours. And one of the useful things about these techniques is that you are, I guess, providing the child with some level of control through child-chosen goals, through asking the child's ideas and opinions, through the child discovering their own strategies, that you can often find that it increases or improves motivation or can address some of those more behaviourally challenging situations with children where the behaviour is there because the child is trying to get more control of the situation. So it can be changing your role in the therapy and using a more non-directive approach within this kind of process can really assist some of those aspects as well. Okay, so this slide just shows how the research has progressed with co-op in particular from the early 2000s, where, as you see there, the theoretical foundation and the protocols developed for children with developmental coordination disorder. But since then, research with children with autism, with acquired brain injury, cerebral palsy, have all shown quite promising results and developed evidence for use of co-op with those paediatric groups. And on the left side of the slide, you can also see that research has applied co-op with adult populations as well. And there's currently ongoing research happening for people with stroke and use of co-op with people with stroke. So the principles that the approach is founded on is quite useful for other types of motor issues, even where there is cognitive impairment that accompanies that. So that's all good news in terms of being able to apply this approach across different groups of clients. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this presentation, and I'll ask Jenny to talk about maybe what might be the next things for you to think about from here in order to be able to start to use some of this information.
Dentro de los mensajes que tenemos para hoy, bueno, uno es hacer un resumen y en realidad decir que la práctica centrada en la ocupación puede usar diversas estrategias, pero lo importante es que se inicia con la ocupación y termine en la ocupación. Es decir, que la ocupación sea el centro de las intervenciones que nosotros hacemos como terapeutas ocupacionales y que finalmente lo que sostiene la filosofía de nuestra profesión. Segundo, es una reflexión nuevamente de lo importante que es desarrollar estrategias para acceder al conocimiento contemporáneo en terapia ocupacional y además reflexionar, esta es una invitación para todos nosotros, después de ver esta presentación y qué es lo que me pasa a mí en particular, reflexionar acerca del foco que yo que he tenido en las intervenciones que he hecho con mis pacientes pediátricos y en la naturaleza de los servicios que presto. Entonces, muchas veces, por ejemplo, como decía yo, estuve trabajando en habilidades motoras finas sin trabajar en escritura o sin trabajar en alimentación, cuando en realidad esas habilidades no se van a transferir y no se traducen en mejoras en la ocupación. Entonces, reflexionar acerca de lo que estamos haciendo y pensar qué tanto nuestra práctica está centrada en la ocupación. Segundo, qué tanto las cosas que hacemos, de la manera en que evaluamos o tratamos a nuestros niños y a sus familias, se relacionan con la práctica centrada en el cliente en términos de darles voz y opinión para que ellos puedan decir qué cosas son importantes para ellos durante el tratamiento y para establecer las metas del tratamiento. Y por último, práctica centrada en la familia, que tiene que ver de qué manera la familia participa y se involucra en este proceso de tratamiento. Y yo comentaba con las colegas australianas algunos recuerdos súper terribles que tengo de mi práctica en un centro pediátrico en donde teníamos una ventana que pintábamos dibujos con témpera para que los papás no pudieran asomarse a la ventana, porque cada vez que se asomaban a la ventana los niños se ponían a llorar y se desconcentraban y no seguían trabajando. Y pensar en cómo esta práctica, que ahora me entristece, hace en realidad que la familia esté súper fuera del proceso de intervención. Entonces, cuando uno le pide a los papás que sigan instrucciones, que se enganchen dentro del tratamiento, que colaboren o que puedan replicar en el hogar, no tienen ni idea de lo que van a hacer porque ni siquiera fueron capaces de ver lo que uno estaba haciendo dentro de la sesión de terapia. Entonces, como después de esta reflexión, y yo creo que hay un montón de información que va a ser súper relevante para nuestra práctica, pero pensar de qué manera yo puedo ir dando pequeños pasos para hacer práctica que sea más centrada en la ocupación y más centrada en el cliente y en su familia. Y por último, la relevancia de qué es lo que estamos haciendo ahora, de generar alianzas internacionales para empujar el desarrollo de la práctica basada en la ocupación en Latinoamérica. Eso, y finalmente tenemos una imagen de nuestra página web, teobasadenevidencia.com, en donde vamos a subir todos estos webinars y en donde vamos a ir subiendo paulatinamente conocimientos que hemos estado ahora compartiendo con ustedes. Y las referencias.
Okay, so well done on paying attention for that long, everybody. I will see you in an upcoming presentation. Well, I'll see you now for questions, won't I, once you've watched this. And I look forward to contributing further to everything that's happening with occupation-centered practice in Chile and in Latin America.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, Jody está aquí. Hi, Jody.
Hola, buenas noches, everybody.
Buenas noches. Bueno, a todos presento a Jody Copley. Ella es la persona que realizó la presentación. Y Jody, we just finished, so there are two people in the chat that were asking questions. So we will allow them to have a camera and to ask you. Leticia, are you there? ¿Estás ahí, Leticia? Para que actives tu cámara y le hagas preguntas a Jody. Jody, I don't know if you want to say something before starting.
I apologize that the presentation was so long and it is very late at night for you now.
Pido disculpas porque la presentación fue muy larga y es muy tarde para nosotros, para ustedes en Chile.
Colegas, los que tengan preguntas y quieran preguntar directamente, levanten la manito y les vamos activando su micrófono.
¿Esta Leticia? ¿Ya la activé?
Sí, acaba de entrar.
Ya.
Tiene que solo activar su micrófono.
Y la Dani, Mirna. Voy a buscar al resto de las personas mientras.
Daniela también quería hacer una
Dani
pregunta.
Bajolt.
Sí. Yo te la voy agregando, Ginny. Dale nomás.
De YouTube solamente muchos saludos desde Bolivia, Bogotá, Colombia, Barranquilla, Curitiba. No hay ninguna pregunta por estos lados. Así que...
Ahí está la Dani. Mirna. Ya, ¿alguien de las que tenía preguntas si quieren?
Leticia.
Leticia, Daniela y Mirna.
Están todas con las cámaras habilitadas.
Hola. Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hola Mirna, mucho gusto.
Hola.
Mucho gusto. Desde México. Bueno, únicamente compartir que justo eso, como menciona Catherine Trombley, ¿no? La ocupación como medio y como fin. Ciertamente a veces nos perdemos en paradigmas antiguos de focalizar nuestra intervención, ¿no? En un dedo, un pie, una zona, sin ver a la persona como un todo, ¿no? Como qué es lo que siente cuando hace esa actividad, qué es lo que más le gusta, cómo lo disfruta. Entonces, bueno, realmente para mí ha sido muy enriquecedor y me vino a la mente esa frase, ¿no? La ocupación como medio y como fin.
Muchas gracias. Voy a traducir para Jody ahora. Jody, she's saying hello from Mexico.
Ah, hello. Hola.
And she said that it was so enriching for her to listen to the presentation, and how it makes so much sense to think about the occupation as a mean and as a end. And sometimes we get lost in treating just a hand or a piece of the body, rather than thinking about seeing the intervention and considering the person as a whole, or what they like or what motivates them. So yeah, that was the comment. So thank you.
Gracias, muchas gracias.
¿Alguna otra pregunta, Dani?
La Dani la puede hacer directamente.
No, pero para todos los participantes.
Pero después la traduzco encima.
No, thank you, Jody. I'm going to do it in Spanish, even though I can speak in English. Así que
English is excellent.
Yo quería, lo que pasa es que efectivamente el modelo nos pone como nombre a muchas cosas que de repente hacemos de manera espontánea, de como tratar de ayudar a los niños a asociar elementos para poder cognitivamente recordarlos y poder implementarlos. Pero es interesante de repente si nos puede contar, Jody, de su experiencia con niños que tengan más dificultades desde el aspecto, desde un trastorno ansioso, o desde muchas dificultades con el tema de la tolerancia a la frustración, en donde el proceso reflexivo y en el fondo la mirada de mis problemas o de mis dificultades está un poquito, en el fondo, interferido. Si es que nos puede contar un poco de eso.
Ya. ¿Quieres hacerle la pregunta en inglés tú, Dani, o quieres que yo...?
Como quieras, me da lo mismo.
No, pregúntale nomás tú, dale.
Go on, Dani, do it in English.
Okay, yeah, I have no issues with that. I was just asking that if you can just tell us about your experience regarding working with children that have more anxiety issues or frustration issues, since that cognitive ability to think about what I have done wrong instead of just going on and doing whatever we're asking them to do, or play whatever we're asking them to play. If you can just tell us about your experience working with the co-op and those kind of children.
Yeah, certainly, yeah.
And Jody, sorry, Dani was also saying that this model is just giving us a name for what they do, sometimes in a kind of more intuitive way in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes, I agree, Daniela. And I think when approaches like co-op were first introduced in Australia, a lot of therapists had a similar experience because, you know, you intuitively or automatically focus on some of those techniques and use those in practice. And it really just systematized that process for therapists so that it's not dependent on their level of experience or how connected they were with the child, but something that could be taught and learned and refined for consistency. And also, I think people often would think, this was our experience in Australia, would think that, yeah, we're doing all of that already, but perhaps we weren't connecting it as specifically with the achievement of the goals in the occupational context. So it really made us very specific about that we weren't assuming that the occupational goals were being achieved or that that things were improving in daily life, because this became then our measure of success. So even when people thought, yes, I'm already doing that, actually they weren't doing all of that, all of the elements of that, in it being as non-directive and child, giving the child more of the ability to come up with the strategies and remember the strategies and that kind of thing. Do you want to translate that, Jenny, before I go any further?
Yes, please. Entonces, la primera parte que Jody respondió fue en torno al comentario de que lo que decía Dani, que muchas de estas cosas nosotros las estamos haciendo actualmente o las hacen en práctica, pero de una manera mucho más intuitiva, y Jody decía que está de acuerdo y que cuando COOP fue recién como presentado o fue conocido en Australia, muchos terapeutas ya hacían parte de las estrategias que COOP propone. Intuitivamente se enfocaban en técnicas o en estrategias que se usan en COOP, pero lo que hace este modelo en el fondo es sistematizar y darle una estructura rigurosa a lo que estamos haciendo, y eso hace que sea un proceso disponible para nosotros como terapeutas ocupacionales y que la calidad de la intervención no dependa en la experiencia del terapeuta o en qué tan conectado está el terapeuta con el niño. Entonces da consistencia a lo que hacemos. Luego dijo que en la experiencia australiana lo que pasaba era que sí, estaban ocupando muchas de estas como estrategias cognitivas, sin embargo, para muchos terapeutas no había conexión entre lo que estaban haciendo y este foco como centrado en la ocupación. Entonces, podríamos asumir que esto mejora la calidad de vida, pero no siempre se traduce en el fondo en todos estos elementos de poder darle al niño habilidades para que pueda progresar en su desempeño ocupacional. Ok, Jody.
So the second part of the question, Daniela, about children with anxiety or children who are frustrated, I think that's a real factor in using something like co-op. There are two things. Firstly, often the child-chosen goals and the fact that the child is mastering what they're wanting to master can assist with some of that self-efficacy and improves the self-efficacy as you move along. However, I think it's a very good question because sometimes children who are more anxious are far more aware of their performance and the problems and the fact that they're likely to fail. So it's important that we still incorporate the other techniques that we would incorporate as OTs, like providing the just right challenge and enabling success and working alongside the child rather than being too confrontational, because all of that questioning can seem a bit confrontational. So all of the techniques that you use by focusing on the activity, not the child, and those sorts of things, and working alongside, and sometimes taking turns with the child so that you are showing, you're demonstrating your own learning as well, and that curious approach, I think that can help as well, because the therapist is discovering along with the child, so they feel less intimidated. But the other thing I find is that because with co-op in particular, you're focusing on the occupational task the child finds difficult, and they have sometimes built up a resistance to that. So when they come to therapy, it's like, oh, I'm going to do all these things that are difficult for me every day. Sometimes I find that there's a need to break that up in order to gain the child's trust and confidence early on, and to do things like not just sit down and do handwriting like you would at school, or do the things that are difficult, you know, that they, in the way that they do them, but I guess simulate the task in a slightly different context, so you disguise it a little bit. So if you're working on letter formation, don't start with it, doing it on a book like you do at school, but get a water pistol and do the letter formation on the wall, or draw it on the concrete with the chalk and make rainbows, and disguise things so that it doesn't look exactly like the occupational task in the context, until you gain more confidence, and then you can get closer to the context.
Oh, I will translate. Sorry. Ya, voy a tratar de, o sea, anoté todo. Decía que cuando estamos trabajando con niños ansiosos o que se frustran con facilidad, que no tienen tolerancia a la frustración, y que es un factor bastante importante en co-op. Entonces, lo primero es que esta posibilidad de que el niño elija sus propias metas y además tenga como, sea competente y pueda alcanzar sus objetivos, hace que los niños mejora como el sistema de autoeficacia, que es la teoría que vamos a revisar en el próximo webinar, y que hace que los niños se motiven y estén mucho más conscientes de su desempeño. También decía que como estos niños están conscientes de que hay cosas que no pueden hacer, que en el fondo hacen mal, entonces, y que tienen muchas chances de fallar, hace que también sea más desafiante el usar co-op, porque uno está usando estrategias y preguntas que desafían al niño a evaluar su desempeño. Entonces, una de las cosas, junto con usar co-op, hay otras cosas relevantes que se pueden usar, como por ejemplo, hacer tareas que tengan el desafío justo, es decir, que no sea muy difícil ni muy fácil para el niño, de manera que nosotros le permitamos ser exitoso. Y la otra cosa es trabajar junto al niño, de su lado, y no en forma como confrontacional cuando yo lo estoy desafiando a hacer cosas. Entonces, estrategias útiles son, por ejemplo, tomar turnos con el niño y demostrar tu propio aprendizaje como terapeuta y descubrir junto con el niño en este camino, ser como más partner, que en una relación más igual que en una relación vertical. Otra cosa importante es que el niño sabe que cuando va a ir a terapia él va a tener que hacer cosas que para él son difíciles, como por ejemplo que no se puede sentar a escribir en el colegio. Entonces, una posibilidad es como desmenuzar o dividir en pasos esta tarea para dar confianza al niño y que al inicio él se sienta competente y como construir esta confianza entre los dos. Y segundo, es no hacer lo mismo, la misma tarea con las que tienen problemas. Entonces vamos a simular tareas que se parecen a lo que ellos tienen que hacer en concreto. Como por ejemplo, yo decía que si un niño tiene problemas para escribir en el colegio, lo que voy a hacer no es sentarlo en una mesa a escribir, que es exactamente lo que él hace en el colegio, sino que voy a buscar como estrategias para despistar al niño, y daba el ejemplo, por ejemplo, de usar una pistola de agua y escribir en la muralla la letra, o usar tizas y escribir como con colores de arcoíris la letra en otro sector. Entonces, para que la tarea no parezca exactamente, no sea igual a la tarea que ellos realizan y con la que tienen dificultades en la vida real. Ok, Jody.
Jenny, en relación a lo mismo, a COP preguntan por ahí la edad de aplicación.
Jody, what is the age, the age range for applying the co-op?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the research, there have been studies that they've applied from children from age 4, I think, from 4 years. My experience, sorry, go.
Yeah, no, en la investigación dice que lo han aplicado en niños desde 4 años, y en su experiencia. Okay.
I want to emphasize that in usual practice, therapists might only use co-op in its pure form, you know, less commonly, but it's really common to use elements or strategies from co-op and blend that with other aspects of therapy. So often, even with quite young children, you know, even 3-year-olds, you might talk to them about you know, evaluating strategies that work for them. So what helps, you know, using language that works with them. So I remember a maybe 3.5-year-old little girl I would work with, and she was very sensory seeking, and would be moving constantly, lots of difficulties sitting still, lots of moving around, and we would talk about establish a language between us that she could understand. So we talk about her jumping beans. So she has jumping beans in her that make her move all the time. And what can we do to calm down our jumping beans? And then we would come up with ideas and she would try that. So, you know, it's about that's an example of using just common language at the level of the child, but that might be difficult to use the whole co-op process with somebody that young. But it really is about looking at their level of cognition and their understanding. I think when you see children, like I think when I'm assessing a child, I think, oh, this child would be really good for cognitive strategies, because often the children we see are quite bright and have other difficulties, but are able to sort of engage in some joint problem solving at the level of their cognition and language.
Ok. Dijo que, como dije al inicio, que en la investigación lo que dicen es que de los 4 años en adelante, y que ella quisiera enfatizar que la aplicación pura de co-op es cada vez menos frecuente en la práctica. Entonces lo que se ve es que los terapeutas actualmente usan elementos o estrategias de co-op, pero que lo mezclan o lo usan en conjunto con otras terapias. Decía que en su experiencia clínica ella vio una niña, incluso en niños de 3 años, la idea es poder evaluar las estrategias que sirven para ellos. Contaba la historia de una niña que fue su paciente o cliente o usuario, que tenía 3 años y medio y era buscadora de sensaciones, se estaba moviendo siempre, no podía permanecer sentada y tenía dificultades por eso. Entonces trataron de identificar en un lenguaje que fuera significativo para los dos y como un lenguaje común entre la terapeuta y la niña, Jody y la niña, de poder explicar esta situación. Entonces la manera que la niña lo explicó era que tenía unos porotos saltarines adentro, y entonces trataron de buscar dentro de su cuerpo, y la manera de buscar estrategias como cognitivas para poder controlar la conducta es estrategias para poder controlar estos porotos saltarines que estaban adentro. Entonces, con este lenguaje, poder como enganchar al niño y hacer que busque estrategias cognitivas que sean significativas para él. Luego dijo que debido a lo complejo de co-op, probablemente en niños muy pequeños, y debido a la complejidad de las instrucciones, no se podía usar con niños demasiado chicos, pero que sí se podían usar algunas estrategias, y que al evaluar al niño, uno se daba cuenta inmediatamente que, porque en general tratamos a niños que son bien brillantes, que iban a ser súper buenos candidatos para usar estrategias cognitivas en la intervención. Ok.
Hola a todos. Bueno, tengo una pregunta desde YouTube. Daniela nos pregunta ¿de qué forma podríamos adaptar este modelo en el contexto de pandemia a una terapia de telesalud? So, hi Jody, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Sebastian, nice to see you too. My new student.
Yes.
Daniela from where I really don't know where is Daniela, but she's asking, in this context, in our pandemic context, how can this model be adapted to telehealth therapy?
Okay, I have not experienced doing this via telehealth, but our clinic here at UQ has converted most of their services to telehealth at the moment. and they use a lot of co-op strategies in their practice. In many ways, the occupation-centered practice, especially co-op and occupational performance coaching, are very suited to telehealth delivery because they're predominantly verbally delivered, and you're not, apart from things like helping the child feel the movement, you know, the strategy of feeling the movement, apart from that, where you might actually facilitate something physically, most of what you're doing is talking with the child to get them to think about things differently and try something differently and then evaluate it themselves. So it actually is quite suited to telehealth delivery. Having said that, much of what we're doing with telehealth is that we have somebody who is with the child in the child's environment is a facilitator. So if there is any need to, you know, if the child decides they want to try a different position and they actually need some physical assistance to achieve that, to, you know, hold the knife and fork in a certain way or to move their body in a different way, and you want to help them feel that position or feel the movement, then you would ask the facilitator, which would be a parent usually, or it's just somebody who's with them in their home, or if I don't know if your children are going to school, our children are going to school.
No.
No. So probably the parent. So like all telehealth, there would need to be that really good communication with a facilitator, but I think that is less required in these sorts of therapy than with more directive therapies.
Okay. Dice que ella en particular no tiene experiencia en telerehabilitación, pero en esta escuela, en la escuela acá, hay una clínica un centro de telerehabilitación y que han pasado casi todos los servicios que se prestan de terapia ocupacional a telehealth. Que se puede, y que una de las cosas que están usando más en términos de la práctica centrada en la ocupación es co-op y también el coaching del desempeño ocupacional, que lo revisamos en una de las diapositivas. Que en particular es útil porque co-op tiene la mayoría de estrategias o coaching que se entregan, las estrategias se entregan verbalmente. Entonces, exceptuando esta técnica de sentir el movimiento, todas las otras técnicas son verbales, por lo cual sería mucho más fácil el poder hacer la intervención a través de telehealth, porque no necesitamos estar en contacto con el niño, ni tocarlo, ni hacer ninguna como facilitación física. Entonces, que una de las cosas claves en telehealth, bueno, no solamente en esto, sino en todo, es poder encontrar a alguien que esté con el niño y que pueda asistir en las tareas. Entonces, en general, siempre, por ejemplo, las sesiones que se hacen, está el profesor cuando está en el colegio con un niño, hay alguien que está que se llama facilitador, que está asistiendo al niño durante la sesión. Entonces, lo más importante es que uno mantenga una comunicación adecuada con ese facilitador y sea el facilitador al otro lado de la cámara quien sea en el fondo nuestros brazos y nos pueda ayudar a llevar adelante la terapia, pero debido a que la mayoría de las instrucciones y co-op se basan en estrategias verbales cognitivas, no es necesario estar ahí presente. Así es que se adapta perfectamente a telerehabilitación.
Can I add, Jenny, that
Yes.
it can be an advantage to be doing the therapy while the child is in their home or in their usual environments, because it's closer to the context of the occupation. An example is one of our therapists here who also works privately. She will have, she's seeing a young boy who wants to play basketball, and he takes the iPad with him to the basketball court, and she provides the therapy from her office.
Quería decir que otro ejemplo, o sea que esto de la teleterapia puede ser una súper ventaja para nosotros porque la terapia está pasando en la casa del niño y que es lo más cercano que podamos tener a su contexto y al contexto de donde se desarrolla la ocupación. Entonces contaba la historia de una terapeuta ocupacional de acá que en su práctica privada ella estaba trabajando con un niño y actualmente están trabajando en mejorar el desempeño del niño a jugar básquetbol. Entonces lo que hace es que el niño con el iPad sale al patio, lo pone en donde él tiene el aro de básquetbol y desde ahí ella realiza como el coaching, la intervención. Ok.
Jenny, son las 9:25, hacemos la última pregunta.
Ya.
Vale, pues en función del tiempo, tenemos una pregunta aquí de Andrea Ulloa, hace un rato. No puede prender el micrófono por razones familiares, pero dice si Jody nos puede entregar alguna clave o estrategia para los terapeutas ocupacionales para fortalecer la práctica centrada con los niños, ya que en nuestra cultura la visión está puesta principalmente en el adulto.
Sí.
Eh,
Jody.
so-
Perdón, Seba, dale.
yeah.
Dale.
Jody, could you give us some key or a strategy for OT to improve our practice with children? Because in our culture, Andrea says that our vision, the adult is more important than kid. So can you give some advice or some key to improve our practice?
I think, Jody, sorry, is in terms of how can we be more client-centered, child-centered?
Well, I think, you know, in pediatric practice here in Australia, really it is understood as you would all agree, I think, that really it's about family-centered practice. But family-centered practice has the understanding that your client is the whole family, including the parents. But the important part of that is to give the child a voice in the therapy. So a lot of these techniques, the goal setting tools and some of the strategies for in co-op and these sorts of therapies is in order to give the child a voice. Because if there is no buy-in, commitment from the child, the success will not be long lasting. Sometimes what we do is we negotiate goals so that the child can have 2 goals and the parent has 2 goals, and so the child is given a voice in the therapy. I think it's difficult because as the therapist you need to spend equal time with the parent, understanding the parent's needs and understanding the parent's concerns, but our role is also to provide more understanding as to why the child is having the difficulties they have, which is why in the presentation I talked about where you might want to do further assessment of sensory processing and those sorts of things, because it helps the parent to understand the issues that the child is facing and why they're having the challenges that they're having. So I think if the focus is on understanding the child and helping the parents to understand the child's behaviour and us being an agent of that understanding, then it sort of sets up the situation so that parents expect that you're going to be giving the child more control and more agency and more ownership. But it's really important that you're conveying the evidence, that you're explaining the evidence-based practice to the parent so they can see why you're going in that direction, because the evidence tells you that if you give the child a voice and if you give them some agency in the situation, it will work better. They'll have more success and they'll achieve the goals more.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jenny, I talk too much.
Se le perdieron los...
Estoy tratando de encontrar en dónde empecé. Ya, Andrea, y para todos. Dijo que acá en Australia, en realidad, más que pensar en cómo, porque yo le dije al inicio que era práctica centrada en el paciente, y ella decía que en realidad, más que práctica centrada en el paciente o cliente o en el niño, lo que entendemos todos es que esta es una práctica centrada en la familia. Y por eso pasa, y podemos estar todos de acuerdo, en que nuestro cliente o paciente o usuario es la familia completa y no solo el niño, cuando pensamos en términos de paciente. Y lo otro es que es importante en este proceso, quizás una de las cosas más importantes es darle voz al niño, que a través de estas pautas de evaluación que vamos a usar para establecer las metas, los niños sean parte de definir qué cosas son importantes para ellos, porque eso, lo que la evidencia ha demostrado es que cuando los niños forman parte de la toma de decisión de objetivos de intervención, el niño está mucho más comprometido y tiene mucho más éxito en la terapia. Entonces lo que se puede hacer es hacer como algunos acuerdos en donde voy a considerar 2 objetivos de intervención que han sido establecidos por el niño, otros 2 que han sido establecidos por los padres o por la profesora. Y que como terapeutas lo complejo es que estamos trabajando de manera igual con el niño y con los padres en términos de dedicarles tiempo, y que una de las cosas más importantes es dejar o favorecer que los padres entiendan por qué el niño tiene esas dificultades. Por ejemplo, si vamos a hacer una evaluación de procesamiento sensorial, es porque uno de los motivos principales va a ser porque nosotros queremos entender y hacer entender a los padres cuál es la razón por la cual los niños presentan determinados comportamientos. Entonces así entendemos y hacemos que las familias sean agentes en términos de, porque entienden lo que está pasando, de poder unirse a la intervención, y además entender de que le estamos dando voz al niño porque eso le da control y un sentido como de autoría de lo que está pasando durante el proceso. Y también tenemos que ser capaces de explicarle a los padres en términos de la práctica basada en evidencia. Si recuerdan en los webinars anteriores, cuando hablábamos de los 4 componentes de información, cuando pensamos en la práctica basada en la evidencia, voy a hablar y explicar en términos del niño qué es lo que pasa, voy a hablar en términos del ambiente, voy a hablar en términos de lo que dice la evidencia científica de acuerdo a esta intervención, y eso también explica el por qué estoy usando pautas de evaluación que toman en consideración la voz del niño y lo hacen tener como un rol protagonista en esta intervención y tener voz y ser agentes en este proceso de cambio.
Jenny, para resumir respecto a lo último que tú cerraste, Samantha nos pregunta respecto un poco a la Convención del Niño, ¿cierto? Finalmente, si la práctica centrada en el niño es algo habitual en Australia.
Jody, this is the last question. Leo is asking if child-centered practice is common in Australia.
Yes. In a word, yes. I think it has been a basis of practice for a very long time, but I think over the last maybe 15 years, we have refined it so that, again, the child has more of a voice. So we didn't used to have goal-setting tools that were specific to children. Those have only been developed in the last couple of decades. So that is now more used in practice. Having said that, so child-centered there are a lot of different components to child-centered, and it's not just about child-chosen goals. It's also about making sure there's a really, really clear picture of the way the child performs within the context and the environments that they're doing their occupational tasks. So that's very child-centered as well. And I think that the extent to which people formally use child-chosen goals and those sorts of things really depends on time and usual practice. So it'd be very common for therapists to ask the child what's important to them and ask about their perceptions. And some of the time, people would use a formal tool.
Yeah.
But can I emphasize, Jenny, too, that one of the things about occupation-centered practice and child-centered practice is that I know in Latin America you have less access to a lot of the tools and assessments and so forth in Spanish language to use. And I think that it's important to know that with occupation-centered practice, there are a lot of techniques and ways of working that do not depend on formal published tools, that you can still do occupation-centered practice without having access to all of those.
Okay. Leo entonces dijo que en resumen la respuesta es sí, que sí, la práctica centrada en el niño o en el cliente es parte de la práctica común y que ha formado parte de la base de la práctica de terapia ocupacional en Australia por harto tiempo, pero que ella diría que en los últimos 15 años, en donde esto se ha refinado y se le han usado estrategias para darle voz al niño. Y que antes no existían estas pautas de evaluación, y especialmente para niños, y se han creado solamente en las últimas décadas, y ahora es mucho más común en práctica. Y que es importante en esta mirada como de la práctica centrada en la ocupación, tener como una imagen súper clara de cómo el niño se desempeña en su ambiente real, en su contexto real. Y decía que saber en qué medida, como formalmente, los colegas australianos usan estas herramientas de evaluación, en realidad depende también del tiempo y como de los recursos y el entrenamiento que tengan, pero que es enfocado en el paciente, y ella quisiera enfatizar que la atención centrada en la ocupación y la práctica centrada en el niño es cada vez más común, y que eso no debería depender, que ella sabe que nosotros en Latinoamérica no tenemos acceso a muchas de las pautas de evaluación que no están en idioma español, y es información a la que no tenemos acceso, pero que en el fondo la falta de acceso no debería ser una determinante para que nosotros no podamos hacer práctica centrada en la ocupación y práctica centrada en el niño.
Muchas gracias, Jody, y gracias a los colegas que se conectaron hoy día con nosotros, que fueron en promedio 200, así que nos vemos el miércoles 19 de agosto con el programa centrado en el hogar y teoría de la autodeterminación.
Sí, Jody, vamos a cerrar ahora, entonces, Jody.
English, Jenny.
I have my wires crossed.
I'm not surprised.
We will close the session now. So I don't know if you want to say something. Everyone in the chat said that they are very thankful. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was excellent. So thank you very much for all the time that you have committed to the project, and thank you for being so passionate about working with Latin America and Chile.
We're occupational therapists. We are all passionate. Yeah. Even Australian.
Yeah, I know.
Mucho gusto. Muchas gracias. Lo siento.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Gracias de todos los colegas de Latinoamérica por esta oportunidad de escucharle, y la esperamos para su próxima presentación.
Así será. Eso, muchas gracias a todos y miles de cariños, y perdón por todas las interrupciones, pero en realidad esta cuestión de derribar la barrera del idioma es bastante complejo. Así es que eso, pero bueno, vamos en el camino correcto, yo creo. Así es que muchos cariños y muchas gracias a todos quienes participaron, muchas gracias a quienes dieron sus opiniones, gracias Leo, gracias Seba. Así es que eso, hasta la próxima.
I'll be back to talk about hypertonia.
Yes.
Hypertonia.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Muchas gracias. I will call you, Jody. Thank you so much.
Gracias. Chao.
Chao.
Bye bye.
Bye. Ya voy a cortar para todos.
Chao a todos, muchas gracias.
Sí, gracias a todos, miles de cariños.